Hello, everybody. My name is Khalil Thompson, and I'm going to be discussing the work of Karl Spencer Lashley. Karl Spencer Lashley was born on June 7, 1890, in the town of Davis, West Virginia. He was the only child of Charles and Maggie Lashley. He grew up in a middle-class family with a comfortable lifestyle and a fascination of learning and education. He made an extraordinary achievement at the age of 14 when he graduated high school, exhibiting the intellectual prowess of a prodigy. He enrolled at West Virginia University, where he had originally decided to major in English. However, he eventually enrolled in a class in zoology and decided to major in this field due to the interactions with a specific professor that will be discussed later. When speaking of this professor, Lashley wrote, "Within a few weeks in his class, I knew that I had found my life's work." He finally obtained his BA in zoology in 1910. After obtaining his BA, he earned a teaching fellowship at the University of Pittsburgh, where he received his master's degree in bacteriology and taught biology along with biological laboratories around campus. He then went on to study genetics at Johns Hopkins University under zoologist Herbert S. Jennings. At the same time, Lashley became acquainted with the psychiatrist Adolph Meyer and psychologist John B. Watson, who all greatly influenced his professional development in psychology and neuroscience. He obtained a PhD in genetics in 1911 at Johns Hopkins. Lashley spent 3 years conducting vertebrate behavior research for his postdoc from 1914 till 1917. During this time, Lashley began designing the research program that was to occupy the remainder of his life. In 1920, he became an assistant professor of psychology at the University of Minnesota in Minneapolis, where his prolific research on brain function gained him a professorship in 1924. Lashley was appointed professor of the University of Chicago in 1929, where he taught until 1935. In 1929, he served as the president of the American Psychological Association. He was employed by Harvard University in 1935 and stayed there until his retirement in 1955. In the latter half of his tenure at Harvard, Lashley also served as the director of the Yerkes Laboratories of Primate Biology in Orange Park, Florida from 1942 to 1955. The three most influential people in Lashley's journey to acclaim to neuroscience were his mother, Maggie Spencer, his zoology professor, John Black Johnston, and the esteemed John B. Watson. Maggie was a strong proponent of schooling and education, and from an early age she encouraged Karl intellectually. She owned a vast book collection and would often teach the neighborhood women various subjects in her free time. As a result, he was able to read at the age of 4. John Black Johnston was a famous neurologist who taught the zoology course that would convince Lashley to pursue animal science as a career. And at Johns Hopkins University, he was trained by the founder of the behaviorist movement in American psychology, John B. Watson. He shared his interest in comparative psychology, but did not agree with Watson's stimulus-response approach to behavior. Lashley eventually parted ways with the evolving theoretical perspective of his mentor by emphasizing the neurobiological basis for sensory motor and memory representations in the brain. He believed the mind held elevated importance in the manifestation of behavior, contrary to what John B. Watson was advocating at the time. Lashley pioneered experimental work conducted on rats with surgically induced brain lesions. Lashley made several fundamental discoveries about how the brain stores and processes information. This work led Lashley to another area of study, the one that he focused on during the rest of his career, and the area he became the most famous for, cerebral localization. Combining the insights from behaviorism and his research with trained rats, Lashley hypothesized the existence of a local area in the brain where memories of learned responses are stored. Lashley called this area the engram, or the memory trace. This idea was consistent with the teachings of behaviorism, and he pursued them for a substantial portion of his career. He trained rats to perform specific tasks, such as seeking a food reward, within a visual discrimination paradigm that used mazes. He then lesioned specific areas of the rat cortex, either before or after the animals received the training. Cortical lesions had specific effects on acquisition and retention of knowledge, but the location of the removed cortex had no effect on the rat's performance in the maze. This led Lashley to conclude that memories are not localized, but that they were widely distributed across the cortex. Lashley is quoted as saying, "This series of experiments has yielded a good bit of information about what and where the memory trace is not. It has discovered nothing directly of the real nature of the engram. I sometimes feel in reviewing the evidence on the localization of the memory trace that the necessary conclusion is that learning is not possible. It is difficult to conceive of a mechanism that can satisfy the conditions set for it. Nevertheless, in spite of such evidence against it, learning sometimes does occur. Today we know that distribution of engrams does in fact exist, however the distribution is not equal across all cortical areas, as Lashley assumed. Lashley eventually authored a monograph called Brain Mechanisms and Intelligence in 1929, which contained two principles that were a result of his lesion research: mass action and equipotentiality. Mass action essentially describes the idea that the rate, efficiency, and accuracy of learning was dependent on the absolute surface area of cerebral cortex available. If cortical tissue is destroyed following the learning of an intricate task, poor performance on the task is determined more by the amount of tissue destroyed than by its location, contradicting his previous views on localization of brain function. Equipotentiality describes the idea that one part of the cortex can compensate for the function of another part. Within a functional area of the brain, any tissue within that area can perform its associated function and is involved in integrating functions on multiple modules in the brain. Therefore, to destroy a function, all the tissue within a functional area must be destroyed. If the area is not destroyed, then the cortex can take over another part. Although his views are not considered too extreme, the principle that memories are now localized to a single spot in the brain is now well accepted. Lashley also discovered that embedding insulating chips in rat cortices and showing that they had minimal effects on learning and behavior, that contra to Gestalt theories of the era, the cortex processed information in a pattern of activity and connectivity among neurons, not in global field and wave effects propagating through a medium. He also showed that lesions that undercut slabs of cortex had far more severe consequences than lesions that were perpendicular to the cortex, which suggested that the principal circuits of the cortex ran up and down while into the white matter, then side to side across the cortical surface. Additionally, in 1951, Lashley published a famous paper called The Problem of Serial Order in Behavior, in which he pointed out that complex sequential behavior, such as playing a piece on the piano, could not be executed by one response sending a sensory motor signal back to the brain, which could then trigger the next response in the sequence. There just wasn't enough time for the neural signals to travel through the nervous system for this to occur. He's quoted as stating that complex sequential behavior was too fast to be explained by the original physiological theory of associative chain, and that elements of the sequence are partially activated before the order is imposed upon them in expression, which suggests that there is some scanning mechanism that must be involved in regulating their temporal sequence. The real problem, however, is the nature of the selective mechanism by which the particular acts are picked out in the scanning process, and to this problem I have no answer. Instead, behavior had to be controlled by a central, hierarchically organized program. This insight has proven critical to the study of motor behavior ever since, and influenced Noam Chomsky's critique of Skinner's theory of language and the development of Chomsky's theory of generative grammar. In February 1954, while teaching at Harvard, Lashley suddenly collapsed and was hospitalized. He was diagnosed with hemolytic anemia and was placed on a cortisone treatment. The cortisone eventually began to soften his vertebrae, and as a result, a splenectomy was performed. He was on the road to a full recovery until his trip to Poitiers, France, with his wife Claire, where he once again unexpectedly collapsed, but this time to his death on August 7, 1958. Lashley overall is regarded as a pioneer in ethology and comparative psychology as well as physiological psychology. Research on engrams continued after his death in the form of Donald Hebb, a student of Lashley. However, his insights also began to influence work in cerebral function distribution, which would influence modern theories of artificial intelligence, cognitive science, neuroscience, psychology, and the philosophy of the mind. Lashley is the author of a number of different notable publications. In 1923, he published The Behavioristic Interpretation of Consciousness in Psychological Review. In 1929, he published Brain Mechanisms of Intelligence, once again in the University of Chicago Press. In 1930, he published Basic Neural Mechanisms of Behavior in Psychological Review. In 1932, he published Studies in the Dynamics of Behavior at the University of Chicago Press. In 1935, he published The Mechanism of Vision, Part 12, Nervous Structures Concerned in the Acquisition and Retention of Habits Based on Reactions to Light. He published this in Comparative Psychology Monographs. In 1943, he published Studies of Cerebral Functioning and Learning in the Journal of Comparative Neurology. In 1950, he published In Search of the Engram, Society of Experimental Biology Symposium. In 1951, he published The Problem of Serial Order in Behavior and Cerebral Mechanisms of Behavior. Lashley is also the recipient of a number of different honors and accolades. In the American Psychological Association, he was a council member from 1926 to 1928, and he was the president in 1929. In the Eastern Psychological Association, he was the president in 1937. He was also a member of the Society of Experimental Psychologists. He was an honorary fellow of the British Psychological Association. He was a member of the American Society of Zoologists, and he was also the president of the American Society of Naturalists in 1947. He was an honorary member of the British Institute for the Study of Animal Behavior, and he was a member of the American Society of Human Genetics and American Physiological Society. He was an honorary member of the Harvey Society and was elected to the National Academy of Sciences in 1930. In 1938, he was elected a member of the American Philosophical Society. Since 1957, the Society has awarded the annual Karl Spencer Lashley Award in recognition of work in the integrative neuroscience of behavior. In 1943, Lashley was awarded the Daniel Gerard Elliott Medal for the National Academy of Sciences, and he was also awarded an honorary Doctor of Science degree from the University of Pittsburgh in 1936, University of Chicago in 1941, Western Reserve University in 1951, and the University of Pennsylvania. And in 1953, Johns Hopkins University presented him with an honorary Doctor of Law degree.